Take a look at the following code. Now, this code is a bit contrived, but I think it'll help you understand a subtlety in how Elixir works. In the math module, there are two functions, add and increment. Add takes two parameters, and it returns the result of adding them together. This function isn't super useful or interesting, but it is helpful in what I'm about to demonstrate. Now, the increment function takes one parameter, which should be a number, and it returns the result of adding 1 to the number that's passed into the function. Take a moment and look at the body of this function. Does this code look right to you? In a lot of languages, the increment function, as it's implemented, wouldn't work. Here's what I mean. On this line, I'm creating an add variable, and I'm binding it to the number 1. Then on the next line, I'm using the same identifier, add, in what appears to be a function call. But isn't add just a number? So how can we use it as a function? And what about this, where I'm passing in the same identifier, add, as a parameter to the add function call? This example probably makes things seem even more confusing, right? So again, do you think this code will work? Let's try it out. I'll fire up IEX, and I'll pass in our file. Well, we didn't get any errors, so it must have successfully compiled. Let's try calling the increment function, and I'll pass in the number 1. Okay, it seemed to work. We see an incremented number as the result. So what's going on here? I mean, how does Elixir know that here I'm referring to a function, and here I'm referring to a variable that's bound to the number 1? Well, the reason this works, even though it might not seem like it should, is because variables and functions occupy different namespaces in Elixir. Okay, well, what do I mean by namespaces? Well, you can think of it like this. The add function you see here is placed in one namespace, and the add variable here is placed in another namespace. When we use add here as a function call, Elixir knows to go over here to this function namespace to find the function. When we use add here, we're not making a function call. We're using it as a variable. So Elixir checks the variable namespace for a value, and since it finds a corresponding variable, it uses its value. There's a name for what I'm describing here. This concept of having two different namespaces is generally a description of Lisp II languages. Now, most popular languages aren't Lisp II languages, they're called Lisp I languages, and they don't have separate namespaces for functions and variables. I'm going to make this example even more contrived, just to make a point. Take a look at this new implementation of the increment function. This time I changed the add variable from a number to an anonymous function that takes two arguments and prints this string and returns the result of adding the two numbers together. So effectively, we've got two add functions. This one's in the function namespace, and this one is in the variable namespace because, well, it's bound to the variable add. Notice I didn't change the call to add right here. So which function do you think gets called when this line executes? Is it the function that resides in the function namespace, or the function that resides in the variable namespace? Let's call the increment function to see. By the way, this IEX session is the same session I started a moment ago, which means it's running the old version of the math module that doesn't include the most recent changes I made. We could exit IEX and restart it to recompile and load the latest changes, but we don't have to do that. Instead, we can recompile the math module from within IEX by using the rhelper function, which is short for recompile, followed by the module name, math. Now that we've recompiled our code, let's call the math module's increment function. Okay, it worked, but we didn't see this string printed, so we know it must have called the add named function that's in the function namespace. So how do we call the anonymous function that's bound to the add variable? This is where the dot syntax comes into play. When we add a dot between the variable and the opening parentheses, we're explicitly telling Elixir to use the variable namespace, not the function namespace. Then the parentheses here calls the function that's in the variable namespace. So let's try it out. I'll include a dot between add and the opening parentheses. I'll save the file. Then in our IX session, I'll recompile the math module. Then I'll call increment again, and this time we see the string called anonymous fn, which is confirmation that the anonymous function was used. If you've never heard of this concept of different namespaces for functions and variables, that probably means you've always used a Lisp 1 language where there is only one namespace. The only other popular, or at least semi-popular languages that I'm familiar with that are Lisp 2 languages are Ruby and Perl. Now you might be wondering, why is Elixir a Lisp 2 language? I mean, what's the benefit? Well, I don't want to head too far down a rabbit hole, as that question gets into language design considerations and pros and cons of each option. However, I will provide a link to a paper that talks about the concept for those of you who really want to dig into this further. I've got a very basic question for you. What is a function? I'm not looking for a perfect academic definition. What I'm asking is, what comes to mind when you think about what a function is? The first thing that comes to mind for me is that it's a block of code that takes some input and it returns a value. Another way of thinking about functions is it's code that transforms one value to another. This off-the-cuff definition that I provided is probably similar to what most programmers would say. But there's something missing from the description I just gave, and I hinted at what this is in prior videos. Do you know what's missing from the function definition I just gave? Here, try and fill in the blank. Functions in Elixir are fill in the blank. Well, functions in Elixir are also values, which means they can be treated like other values. So for example, functions can be passed into other functions, just like other values. And functions can be returned from functions, just like you'd do with other values. When you can treat functions as values, the functions are called first class. This concept of first class functions is one property of all functional programming languages. So what's the benefit of being able to pass functions around as values? And how does this work in Elixir? Well, these are the questions we'll start to look at in the next video.